So please help me welcome Simon to the stand.
It's been an absolute joy for me joining the team at Bitx and working with these guys and learning from them, because while I've been a fan of Bitcoin and what's been happening in that space, for a long time, it's really great to get stuck into it, and it's been a great learning experience for me. So I'm not here to give you a sales pitch, but just quickly a broad overview of Bitx. We are available globally in terms of our wallet and our storage solutions. We also run exchanges in South Africa, Malaysia, Kenya. We're operational in Indonesia. Our head office is in Singapore, but we do all of our development out of Cape Town. So that's us in a nutshell. Our app's available for iOS and Android. You can access us on the web. We've got an HTML5 application as well. So what I want to chat to you about today, of course, is where Bitcoin is and where it's going. Despite being described by futurist, which is never a name I've given myself, who really knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Certainly not I. But it is fun to speculate, so we'll do a little bit of that. What I want to do is look at a recent report from CoinDesk, because they do really fantastic research and monitoring of the ecosystem and what's happening in terms of the news. So we'll take a quick look at some of the numbers that came out of their most recent report. And then I want to turn a bit of a different angle on Bitcoin and look at it as a product. I'm a product person and somebody who works with the design of products. So I want to think about Bitcoin in terms of that and look at it in terms of typical product lifecycle, which I think is quite an interesting way to think about Bitcoin. But before we get to that, just for those of you who came to this conference to learn about Bitcoin, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because we've done that already, and I know that there are a lot of you here. I'm just interested at the kind of ideas, and we can make this sort of interactive. We'll get to the Q&A in a bit. But the words that come into your mind now, having spent time with us over the last 2 days, when you think about Bitcoin, what are some of the words, and feel free to shout them out if you want to, that jump into your mind? Because I've been speaking to some of you over the last 2 days, and this word over here seems to be quite prevalent, volatility, okay? We think of Bitcoin as being volatile, and that's because right now it is. I personally don't think it will be forever. I don't think we must confuse the short to medium term volatility of Bitcoin with its long-term awesomeness, but that certainly is true to describe Bitcoin as volatile at the moment. Complicated is another word I heard, right? Who's feeling like this is all very complicated and still just a tad confusing? Nobody. Okay. There we go. We've got some honest people in the audience. And of course, technologically, Bitcoin is quite complicated, and that's a good thing. But it's also remarkably simple when you get down to what you can do with it. And in that way, I do like the comparison that's often made between Bitcoin in its current form and the early internet. The early internet was something that was just perceived as complicated. Nerds were excited about it. Nobody else understood why they should be, and they thought it was going nowhere. But of course, it was going somewhere. And as complicated as it is, the moment you get it into your hands and it does something awesome for you, all of a sudden the lights start coming on. Quite literally in Lorian's talk, which I enjoyed, and it becomes obvious why this is so awesome. So, Bitcoin's at that stage right now where the nerds are excited, and I count myself among them, even though I'm not a developer or an engineer myself, but I am an excited nerd right now, and I do sympathize with the people out there who look at the current state of Bitcoin and its complexity and don't understand why they should be excited too. But as somebody who is also a designer, I see Bitcoin as having a bit of a design challenge at the moment, right? We've got a really elegant piece of technology in a pretty cuck body at the moment. So, your experience of Bitcoin as a technology varies depending on how you're getting to it. But for the most part, until very recently, the experience of using Bitcoin hasn't been quite so elegant as the technology itself, I think is possibly an understatement, but true. So I see, to be fair, I see the world's problems as design problems. I see everything as having a design solution. And I'm hoping to be part of finding that design solution for Bitcoin, because I do believe that Bitcoin, while it has real value to offer in a B2B way, and as a way of transferring value, etc., I also think that it has a lot to offer consumers, that it will reach the edge of the network and do meaningful things there if we design it competently to do that. And of course, at Bitx, we hope to be part of that solution. But just to look at where Bitcoin is now with some actual stats instead of just my opinions. CoinDesk put out their State of Bitcoin Q1 2015 reports last week. It's available to download for free. I'm sure some of you have read it. But just to pick up at a high level some of the highlights from that report. For example, Q1 2015, so far the biggest quarter yet for Bitcoin investment. We've seen $226 million invested into Bitcoin companies so far this year, out of a projected $676 million for the year, which is pretty amazing. They also picked up on improved regulatory clarity, building confidence and attracting Wall Street. Of course, we haven't seen the actual regulation yet, but we've been seeing promising signs coming out of some of the world's most important markets for this. We've also seen the first futures exchange launch for Bitcoin, which will probably go some way to helping steady that volatility I mentioned earlier. And we started to see some exchanges emerging in the American market that, while they don't have the regulation there just yet, are playing nicely with the regulators and making things far more stable, should I say? Just, increasing confidence for your institutional traders, etc. So Bitcoin becoming far more attractive to your typical financial types, and that's all good stuff. The CoinDesk report also looked at the comparison between the early internet and investment in Bitcoin, which is, I suppose, interesting. $250 million invested in the early internet in 1995, Bitcoin doing almost $350 million last year. And of course, that's something that's going to continue. The early internet that date's wrong. But anyway, in 2015, it's projected that Bitcoin's going to reach $960 million. And just to put it in perspective, the sort of investment in fintech as a total this year is projected to be $3 billion. So Bitcoin companies accounting for about a third of that investment, which is interesting, but also shows you that there's a lot happening in financial technology at the moment and a lot of opportunities in that space for startups tackling the problem. The CoinDesk State of Bitcoin ecosystem looks something like this. These are the companies that they see playing a role in the current ecosystem and helping to shape the world of Bitcoin at the moment. They have sort of 6 categories. They have the wallet providers like Zappo and BitGo, exchanges like OKCoin and Bitstamp, financial services companies, GoGoCoin, Lamassu, the mining companies, payment processing, and then the universals in the middle, which is where we at Bitx find ourselves quite fortuitously positioned, we think. And those really are the companies that are helping to shape the ecosystem right now and sort of shining some light ahead in terms of where Bitcoin is heading. Africa as well features quite prominently in the report, 2 whole slides dedicated to Africa. The takeaway is that if you factor in remittance fees, sub-Saharan Africa, according to CoinDesk, is the most fertile market for Bitcoin at the moment. They do observe, of course, that regulation is going to be key because we haven't seen that emerging from Africa yet. I personally believe that regulation is important and that there's an important role to play for regulators in this whole ecosystem. Things don't change overnight, certainly, and we need to see the regulation that enables this all. But we've seen positive signs there too. So it's good times for Bitcoin. But to get to those 2 lenses I wanted to place on it, just to give a bit of a different spin to things, is to look at Bitcoin as a product and to weigh it as an innovation the way that we typically look at these things. So there's a lot of theory in this space, and there are 2 theories I'd like to pick up on, 2 things that I find useful in evaluating new technologies and thinking about them. And the first one is the diffusion of innovations theory. And that's basically this graph over here that I'll very briefly talk you through. It basically looks at product life cycle and how innovative products move through the market. And it starts out with this little slice over here, which is where the innovators are involved in the new technology. They get it off the ground, they, in a very real way, build it, and they bring the technology to bear. And they, of course, are the first users of that technology themselves. And from there, it jumps into the early adopter space. And the way you think about a product and how it relates to the market, of course, changes as it moves through this cycle. So early adopters are a special crowd. They usually don't mind putting up with technical complexity themselves. In fact, they enjoy it. They like getting involved with the product. They like speaking to the developers of that product. They like getting their hands dirty. They like being part of the solution, part of building this. They give you a lot of great feedback, and they really are. It's awesome to be involved with the product at that stage because you get a lot of feedback, you get a lot of love from the market, and a lot of hate. But it helps you shape things. From there, it jumps into the early majority stage. That's like when Justin Bieber finds out about it and starts tweeting about it. And that's where you start to see the mainstream adoption pick up for a new technology. And that's where you have some difficulties in switching from early adopter mode, where you're used to having a customer base that's very engaged and talking to you all the time, to one that doesn't really care so much about you as much as what you can do for them, etc. And after that, it goes into the late majority stage, which is where Justin Bieber himself probably is now. That's when things start to get less and less exciting. And then finally, the laggards pick up about it. So when your mother starts listening to Justin Bieber, then he really has jumped the shark, and it's all over. The interesting thing is that your saturation point, your market penetration curve, looks something like that throughout this cycle. So things really only start getting interesting from an adoption perspective in that early majority phase. And if you do a good job, of course, products die at various stages. Not all of them make it through this cycle. Then supposing the top of that orange line is 100%, your sort of adoption picks up. So what? Well, in terms of Bitcoin, it's interesting to think about where Bitcoin is right now. Because you see that gap between early adopters and early majority. For technologists, that's a very interesting gap, and we call that the chasm. I can't remember the name of the gentleman who wrote the book called The Chasm, but I can tell you that it is out there, so if you are interested, you can go and get hold of it. But the chasm is an interesting place for a technology to be. It's the most difficult transition to make, is from an early adopter market into an early majority market. And I would venture that Bitcoin is running up against that chasm right now. And will it make it across the chasm? It certainly will. I think adoption alone of Bitcoin at the moment is enough to mean that it'll never go away. But what does Bitcoin look like in the early majority stage? What does Bitcoin look like as a product Justin Bieber uses? We just don't know yet. We're starting to see signs of it, and it's all very exciting, but we need to get through this chasm first. And I think that's going to be the immediate challenge for all of us working in the Bitcoin industry, is how we get across from the early adopters who understand, at a technical level why Bitcoin is so awesome, to the early majority stage, who doesn't care about the technology, only what it can do for them, and wants to see use cases that are immediately obvious, that smack you in the face. They're so obvious, and that's when the early majority will start getting excited. We certainly aren't there yet. The other interesting lens to look at Bitcoin through is the hype cycle, Gartner's hype cycle. I usually don't take what analysts say too seriously, but I do think the Gartner hype cycle is an interesting way of looking at new technologies and products. So that curve looks like that, and you can apply it to just about anything, and it's interesting to do that. So it basically looks at the visibility of a new technology over time. And they've given very ominous names to the different cycles that products go through. So you've got the technology trigger, and then you've got the peak of inflated expectations, and then the trough of disillusionment. Apparently, the two Gartner analysts who devised the hype cycle were reading Lord of the Rings at the time, so you can kind of get an idea where this all came from. Then there's the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. And it's interesting to look at a company like Apple, for example, how they plan their products at various stages of the cycle. It's a methodology that just works very well for a company when they start applying it well. You push the iPhone through, it gets to the peak of inflated expectations where everybody's like, oh my God, this is the best thing we have ever seen. And then, they start seeing what Android can do, and they're like, oh, well, actually, it's not that great. It's actually a bit miff. And then they start the enlightenment to go, okay, this isn't the best thing ever invented, but it's good for a lot of things. So we kind of see the value, and that's when you go, hey guys, check out the iPad, woo! And then, you start the whole cycle again. And you can ride your product through it quite nicely. And I would put Bitcoin probably somewhere around there. So it's been triggered. It's gone through the peak of inflated expectations. It's in the trough of disillusionment right now with a lot of people, and I think it's starting to approach the slope of enlightenment. And that's where we start to go, okay, so maybe this isn't the be-all and end-all of the universe, but it can do a lot of awesome things and meaningful things. And as that enlightenment picks up, things aren't quite as exciting in terms of the price, for example, but they get more consistently awesome. Let's put it that way. And that's where you really see a market taking off for a new technology. And you can have a lot of fun with this. For example, you can plot the price of Bitcoin over this curve and see, how that perhaps interacted with what we perceive the value of Bitcoin to be. I personally think we'll see $1,200 again, but I don't think we'll see it overnight. I think it's something that's going to happen more gradually this time because we're being more realistic about the technology and more realistic about what it means for society, etc. So those are interesting ways to look at Bitcoin, and that kind of gives an overview of where I think Bitcoin is now. Where it's going, I think, is a cool discussion to open up to the room. So I can tell you what I think about where Bitcoin is going. It's going everywhere, and we'll see it used for everything we currently do with money. So I do think Bitcoin is a currency, and I do think it's a great currency. I also think it's a commodity, and it's fantastic as that too. It'll be more fantastic once the volatility goes away, which I believe it will. Will it be used for remittances? Almost certainly. Will it be used to pay for electricity? Well, if it's our money, then sure. There are a lot of interesting things that we're going to see built on top of the blockchain itself. I think it's become fashionable for a lot of people to say, yeah, I'm big on the blockchain, but I don't know about Bitcoin, which I think is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the blockchain is. The blockchain doesn't work without Bitcoin. They're one and the same thing. Of course, you can build interesting applications on top of that technology, but you can't really take Bitcoin out of the equation. That's how things move through the blockchain. I think mobile is going to be important, and I think in the payment space in particular, and we've heard this over the last 2 days, there are a lot of amazing things happening in terms of mobile payments, and that's particularly exciting in Africa because we tend to leapfrog. We come from a very old world scenario in African markets where we're technologically behind the rest of the world, and then the next generation of technology lands, and then we leapfrog. So Africa's a mobile-first continent. Most Africans experience a computer and the internet for the first time on a mobile phone, and that brings a different level of expectation with it in terms of them dealing with companies digitally. They expect you to be mobile and to be mobile first or mobile only, because for most Africans, that's their only computer as well. So we think that mobile is going to be incredibly important. And of course, in developed markets, they're being educated about how awesome mobile can be for money too, thanks to big companies like Apple introducing Apple Pay, fortuitously timed to coincide with rules changing in the States and America moving to chip and sign, they call it, technology, having to update all of their payment terminals for NFC. But more importantly, a company like Apple educating consumers about how elegant and awesome paying for something with your mobile phone can be. I sometimes compare the mobile phone to sort of Pac-Man, just consuming everything else in its environment. It like started out in your pocket and then it ate your watch. Nobody wears watches well, lots of people wear watches, but you don't really need to. It ate the alarm clock. It ate the Walkman. It ate the GPS unit in your car, and it just gobbles up everything around it. And your wallet, I think, is next. It will gobble up your wallet and replace it. And that's where Bitcoin, in terms of payments, needs to be living. So we spend a lot of time on our native apps for iOS and Android, and we think that's going to be vital, especially if you're in Africa. If you aren't mobile, then you aren't here, I don't think. So those are my sort of high-level thoughts where Bitcoin is and where it's going. But I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'd actually like to ask one of our co-founders, Timothy Stranix, to join me up here as we have this discussion and open up for questions. Tim has been working on Bitcoin for far longer than me, is incredibly insightful, helped build the Bitx platform, so I think you'll probably enjoy interfacing with him as well as we move into Q&A. Thank you very much. All right, so do we have any questions, or? Yeah, sure.
Simon, you mentioned that you think the price of Bitcoin should break $1,000 at some point. I'm wondering what you believe will drive the price. I mean, one could argue that there is no intrinsic value to Bitcoin. Do you think the price increase will come about purely as a consequence of mass adoption and usage, or do you think traders like myself who speculate on Bitcoin could bring about some sort of price increase as well?
You know, if we venture out into the world of speculation and opinion, the whole intrinsic value discussion to me, as you know, I'm not an economist or anything, but I find it an interesting one because people will say that something like gold does have intrinsic value. You know, it's just a shiny metal that we found on this planet, and we decided that it had value. And yes, you know, there's value in utility, but you can't argue that Bitcoin doesn't have utility. You know, it clearly has, and we've seen them over the last 2 days. There's massive potential in terms of its use cases. So yes, I think it'll be, you know, the dynamics at play will be adoption. It'll be seeing some really successful use cases, and that will have to drive the value up just like it does for any other commodity. So that's my very simple understanding of it. Tim, would you like to perhaps disagree with me?
Sure, yeah. So also, I mean, I think nobody really has any idea what the price is going to do for sure. My personal opinion is I think it's going to go down a lot more because people are starting to use it more as just a transaction mechanism. So it might, you know, a lot of the price now is based on people thinking it will be a store of value, but if it's just used for transactions, then that's not necessarily the case. But who knows?
I do, and it's going up a lot. Any other questions? There we go.
So to kind of deal with foreign exchange, you really need to go through the Reserve Bank at the end of the day. So in the normal course of events, you go to your bank and you apply and you do your transaction. With Project Falcon now, how are you linking that back to the Reserve Bank so that it can kind of make that whole transaction easier?
So I think, you know, on the one hand, you've got what's happening in terms of switching and the technology and the infrastructure, and on the other hand, you know, you've got the regulation. So, you know, there are lots of analogies one could make that are probably germane with things that are technically possible, but not legal. So, you know, your requirements in terms of filing with the Reserve Bank, there's nothing about Falcon that would negate that. You'd still have to make those filings happen. You know, Falcon is just a more efficient and more elegant way of the actual payments happening. Now, of course, you know, if you want to buy Bitcoin and send it overseas right now, there's nothing technically stopping you. Just like there's nothing stopping you from coming and stabbing me. It's whether or not you think you can get away with it that's important. And of course, you know, there are a lot of examples of remittance with Bitcoin that are perfectly legal if you're within your allowances, etc. But at scale and in the long term, obviously you have to comply with the regulation of the land. It's usually a good idea for remaining as a free citizen of that land. Any other questions?
None.
All right. Great. Thanks a lot, guys. It was awesome hanging out with you. And we'll be around during the break.